to Varsha earlier, Nicole, and for people who are coming in, is that the Virginia Tech Hokies, where I teach, are in the women's Final Four, and they play tonight. In fact, I think the game just started right now, so I will be glancing at my phone to check the score every once in a while. And I am
You're representing.
I'm representing right now. So,
are you actually listening to it through your earbuds? You can't actually hear us.
What? I can't hear you. Sorry.
That would be really funny, though. That would be really funny.
That would be good. Yeah. I think my wife will probably text me score updates as things are going on as well, so it'll be fun. Yes. But I did have one of the, and I mean, it's very exciting, for the school and stuff like that. But one of the players is actually a religion and culture. She's a major in our department, so
that's awesome.
We're rooting for her, especially. So
that's so cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's weird. I mean, like at big schools, and maybe you guys have similar experiences. Like I very rarely teach athletes. I've had like a baseball player every once in a while, or a golf player or something like that. I had one football player who's now in the NFL. He plays for the Bills, who I'm sure does not remember me in any way, shape, or form. But he was a very lovely, nice young man when I met him. He was really shy 18-year-old. And then the women's basketball player is really great as well. So
yeah, I never end up teaching athletes, even in my survey classes, because I think during the survey classes, most people who are not historians realize this is a very difficult class to take to fulfill your requirements comparatively, right, to other classes. U.S. history is not like that hard. It's just the professors at Berkeley care a lot about it, so they'll assign reading, and people in general, not just like athletes, I mean all kinds of majors will be like, no, I'm not doing this, which you got to respect.
Yeah, I have a handful of athletes. I think I have a swimmer and a lacrosse player, but this is my first time teaching since 2015.
Oh,
so it's been a long time since I've had them.
That's so cool. What are you teaching?
It's actually amazing. I love it.
Are you teaching conservatism, like U.S. history, conservatism?
So I'm doing a capstone class on conservatism, but my lecture class is a history of the Obama administration.
Ooh, that is very cool.
It's very fun.
That's as awesome. A medievalist, I mean, that's like barely history, right? So, but anyway,
consensus in my department, but yes,
that's right. All right. Well, let me let's kind of jump in. Welcome everybody to Drinking with Historians. On behalf of Matt and Varsha, we wanted to welcome you, and we're so pleased to have as our guest today Dr. Nicole Hemmer, who is a professor of history at Vanderbilt University, a scholar of American history, conservatism, the presidents, and all kinds of really interesting stuff like that. But for right now, the most important question that we have to ask you, Nicole, is what are you drinking tonight?
So I am drinking Michter's small batch bourbon. It is a Kentucky bourbon, and I am in Tennessee, but it tastes good. So I feel
Also, Tennessee whiskey is I don't like Tennessee whiskey, so
I was also like, oh, can I drink bourbon in front of Varsha? Is she going to be like,
no, you can't. So now, is it my turn to share what I'm drinking?
Sure. Go ahead,
so
please.
I'm on spring break. So as you can see, I don't have my whiskey behind me. So I brought one bottle from Berkeley, my Blanton's. It has lasted me through thick and thin. It's almost halfway gone. And this is like one of the best bourbons I've ever had. So if you ever get a chance to drink it, it's very good. It's very smooth. And it's one of if you know bourbon, if you drink bourbon, the first thing that hits you is the smell of vanilla. This is the Vanilla East bourbon. It's so good.
So there was one of the very few whiskey bars in Miami when I lived there. And I did the thing that I think you do, Varsha, which is I just asked the bartender, what should I be trying? Help me experiment with this. And Blanton's was the one that he poured that I was like, hey, that's what we're doing.
So good.
Yeah. A really hard bottle to get, at least around us too.
Yeah, I mean, this is why it's lasted so long. Yeah.
But very much worthwhile if you can get it. You have three thumbs up, I think, across here for Blanton's. I made myself because again, I'm a fancy boy. I made myself a mixed drink. I'm just drinking. Well, it's actually just a simple Manhattan. I'm using some Old Grandad, which is my kind of go-to mixing bourbon, and then I have some Putte Mess sweet vermouth, little bit of Angostura bitters, and it's just delightful. And I have some Woodford double oaked as my kind of backup drink, because that's kind of my go-to kind of drinking bourbon. It's just so smooth and sweet, and
So
delicious
good.
and stuff like
Yeah.
that. It's so great. So
Yeah.
anyway, I guess we should talk about some other things too. So
Yeah.
I'll throw it over to Varsha.
Yeah, so I just know that your latest book is called Partisans, right? It's about the conservative movement during the Reagan administration. I write a little bit about the Reagan administration, my research on the World Bank in the 1980s. And you make an interesting argument, without spoiling too much of the book, that there's a new type of conservatism on the ground during Reagan. What changes in the Reagan administration and at the end of the Cold War that makes this conservatism new?
Yeah, so the conservatism of the 1980s, there were challengers to Ronald Reagan during that period. And so the first two chapters of the book talk about the Reagan era. And first of all, like Reagan's vision of conservatism, like what Reaganism was, particularly how the Cold War defined it. He really is the ultimate Cold War conservative. And that Cold War context defines his politics and defines the kind of conservatism he embraces. He's taking some fire from some conservatives who are more, who see themselves more in like the George Wallace tradition, who see themselves more as populists, as social conservatives, the people who call themselves the New Right. And they are battering Reagan throughout his presidency. People like Richard Vickery, who I think like 3 weeks into the Reagan administration is complaining, oh, I knew we would get the short end of the stick, but I didn't think it would be this short. And so you have that kind of spray against Reagan during his presidency, but it doesn't go anywhere really, because Reagan is so popular. He's not just popular on the right, but like, you know, he wins 2 back-to-back elections in a landslide. And then George H.W. Bush wins in a landslide in '88. The conservatives who come after him, the end of the Cold War is absolutely vital to opening up the space for a different kind of conservatism to compete with Reaganism. You know, Pat Buchanan is
Paleoconservatism.
Yeah, his kind of paleoconservatism, they're not necessarily calling it that right away. And some of the people that I write about aren't so philosophically consistent or insistent that Buchanan is. But that kind of America First, democracy skeptical conservatism doesn't have a lot of room during the Cold War because it violates some of the kind of core tenets of the US's argument versus the Soviet Union. So once that comes to an end, and then you pile onto that economic changes that have happened and are well underway by the 1990s, demographic changes following the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, and a different media environment. And suddenly there's room for a very vicious conservatism to grow and thrive, and something that looks, I think, more like the conservatism of the 20-teens than the 1980s.
So how much, if I can just kind of follow up on that, is like how much of Reagan's, like this kind of Reagan style of conservatism, which is being kind of pilloried as kind of something kind of wrong by who the people who become the paleoconservatives, how much of that is forged in California? I mean, one of the things that like I was unaware of, like even as, you know, a student of history, my mom was an American history teacher and stuff like that, but like thinking about him as governor of California, like that wasn't kind of in the mix. He was always just like, he was the president, like, you know, that's kind of the vision that we knew about him, or I knew about him, I should say.
California is hugely important because his transition from like a Goldwater conservative, like when he comes out in 1964, he is a by the book conservative movement conservative. And he even imbibes some of the maybe rough edges, the anger, the attitude of Goldwater from the 1964 campaign. He has this one ad that he cuts for Goldwater in 1964, and it literally starts him on a bench being like, I'm mad. And you're just like, what's a different Reagan?
Yeah.
And so when he pivots to become governor of California, when he starts to run, I think he cuts his first ad maybe in 65 or very early 66, he has tempered his position. Like he's not attacking government. He's saying that government should be a junior partner to the people and to business. He's talking more about compromise and pragmatism, and he's imbibing some of that kind of sunny Californianess that will become part of his political strategy, that projection of optimism that is associated with kind of the image of Reaganism, if not actually the policies. But he also, like, he gets into fights pretty early on. Like, he picks a lot of fights with the universities. He finds his own kind of more populist edge, I think, as governor of California. But it's also as governor of California, because he's the governor of a state in the 1960s instead of a country in the 1980s, where he is signing bills, liberalizing abortion laws, putting more restrictions on guns. So he's he's different in many ways in the 1960s and 70s from the Reagan we know.
Yeah, I have a question that sort of ties together Reagan, Nixon, and California, because what you read about Nixon and Orange County and those kind of Republicans being really important for this new right, you realize how important California is for forging this new right. One thing that completely shocked me when I took my first U.S. history survey class was that Reagan was raised by two Democrats. He supported FDR. He was on the he was in the Screen Actors Guild and on their board, and he was very pro-union. So what happens in California that makes him shift his politics? And because he used to be and that's what I find interesting about that leads to my next question. That's what I find interesting about his internationalism. He supports FDR's internationalism, but he shifts away from that type of domestic policy. Because his parents are Democrats, and his parents are anti-racist Democrats.
Yeah, he was bought in as a Democrat. And he ends up becoming the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He's the only US president to also have been a union president. And he is
so cool. And then destroys unions as president. Sorry.
It's an evolution. What happens is that he, as he is kind of aging out of the studio system, he gets hired by General Electric to go around and give speeches, and he hosts the General Electric Theater, which is one of the most popular weekly television shows. That's where most Americans come to know him, not just from his movies, but from this television show that he hosts. And the leaders of General Electric are pretty rough and tumble conservatives. And they want Reagan to give speeches. They want him to give political speeches, and they introduce him to all of these conservative intellectuals and writers. And this isn't Reagan's reputation, but he really is kind of an autodidact when it comes to conservatism. He does read all of these books. He distills their points down onto his little note cards, because that's how he memorizes and remembers things. And he develops a kind of conservatism out of those readings, in support of General Electric, in opposition to unions, that is going to become his politics. He's still a Democrat until I think maybe changes his registration in 1962. And he tells this as a kind of conversion story, but not like Saul on the road to Damascus. He talks about how, he tells when he is running for office, he says, I once was a Democrat. I know how hard it is to pull that lever for Republicans. But, the first time it hurts, and from then on out, it feels good.
Wow. I don't know. I've seen some of his speeches, and before he became president, he is a very charismatic guy. He's very able to, it makes sense that he was a movie star. And I think, so my next question after that, and then, Matt, you can ask the question is, you mentioned that as the Cold War is ending, it opens up a new type of conservatism, but the end of the Cold War will also take something away from conservatism, right? The reason or the need to be an internationalist. And so my question is, how much of Reagan's internationalism actually remains in the Conservative Party today? And is that one of the issues with conservatism today, is that it can't really turn to internationalism anymore as the importance of America's might, and America being safe for democracy and those kind of things?
Yeah, it's tough, because foreign policy is one of those places where, as you know, where there is just so much variety within the conservative movement. Certainly, there is much less room for that kind of inward-facing nationalism after the 1950s or so. It's still there, but there is this much more muscular interventionist foreign policy. There's still a kind of conspiratorial suspicion of multinational institutions. of the United Nations and some of those things. But there is, conservatives are much more willing to engage in the world. And of course, Reagan was as well. He takes heat for it while he is president from this new right. When he begins to enter negotiations with the Soviet Union, he takes fire from all sorts of conservatives for his willingness to engage. That's still part of the conservative movement. There still are internationalists. I mean, it's more challenging now because the kind of president who tried to revive Reaganism, George W. Bush, did a very good job of convincing people it was a terrible idea. And that includes his approach to foreign policy. And that, again, just as the end of the Cold War made a lot of room for this paleoconservatism, this America First retrenchment, the Bush administration blows that wide open and makes even more space for that to not just be a policy option on the right, but to be a prominent, maybe even dominant policy option on the right. So it's not that internationalism goes away, but it's even more contested than it was under Reagan. And I think even more of a minor note than it was in the 1990s. The 1990s were tough because everything was changing.
Yep, definitely.
So do you think that's kind of the tension that we're seeing in some of the foreign policy conversations when they do kind of break through about China, especially now, is that they seem to be in some ways like some on the right and some in the Democratic Party as well seem to want to set up China kind of as the big bad. Is that in the absence of the Soviet Union, in the absence of the global war on terror and Islamic extremism, that they still need, like, the hawk still needs something to hawk at, right? So
yeah, I mean, the idea that the U.S. is caught in some sort of existential struggle is a leitmotif of conservatism, even after the Cold War. And, Varsha, what I actually thought your question was going to be was, the end of the Cold War, do they lose that sort of glue that holds conservatism together? Because the Cold War was doing so much to hold the movement together. And what we're seeing now is just so much variation and a kind of search for different enemies, because so much, especially as conservatism becomes more varied, so much of what holds it together is its opposition to liberalism or its opposition to the Democratic Party. So it's harder to suss out kind of the ideological consistency and instead this reliance on opposition. And that's why sometimes this foreign policy stuff can be really difficult to figure out, because even individual politicians are all over the map on it. They'll go from like denouncing China one day to seeing it as a competitor the next. And you even see that on you see that with somebody like Donald Trump, who sees China as a competitor, but also really admires Xi Jinping because he's moving in a dictatorial direction. And those are the kinds of tensions even within individual politicians.
So go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I have a slightly easier question. In your first book, Messengers of the Right, you're spending a lot of time talking about the media. And that's one of the most important things that people have sort of tried to learn about since 2015, since the elevator and coming down of it, is like, how the heck does conservative media work? And so my question is, how does the media environment, the conservative media environment in the 60s and 70s sort of contribute to what we see today, right? Were you surprised, or were you like, oh yeah, that makes sense, that's how we got Fox,
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are some indicators of where this more popular and even more populist conservative media is going to come from. There is certainly a sense on the right that they need much better venues especially in the 1970s, that they just don't have the reach that they want. And so there's a plan to buy CBS and take it over. And that's kind of a proto image of Fox News. There's a plan under Nixon, GOP TV, the idea that they would cut news segments and send it out to newsrooms across the country so they could play it, kind of a precursor to Sinclair. So you have those kinds of things. But, the media environment changes pretty significantly in the years that follow. You do have in the early 1970s the rise of a kind of a change in mainstream journalism, where they feel like in order to be balanced and in order to be objective, they have to have like a liberal voice and they have to have a conservative voice. So you start to see more conservatives on air in the early 1970s. Phyllis Schlafly becomes a commentator for ABC, CBS. And so you see some of that. In the 1980s is when Pat Buchanan becomes the host of Crossfire on CNN. He becomes a panelist on the McLaughlin Group. So you're starting to see the kind of rise of a class of conservative punditry. But it's really with Rush Limbaugh and talk radio that you see this profitable, entertainment-driven conservative media. And that combination of entertainment and profit make it a much different beast from the people that I write about in Messengers of the Right. I write about this in Partisans, the new sort of conservative media of the 1990s, but also in the context of the rise of political entertainment shows like Politically Incorrect, and the ways that they also serve as incubators for conservative pundits.
Yeah. So is this a train that's already left the station then? Like, I mean, is there anything, so like, I mean, one of the things that I'm sure, our viewers are aware of is like the Fox Dominion lawsuit, right? In which Fox, and in fact, there was just the summary judgment that the judge passed down today, in which they found them guilty kind of immediately. And then there's only one charge that's going to go to trial apparently. But basically like Fox is liable, like for lying about, the 2020 election, which we know that they've lied a lot about the 2020 election. So is that like, do you think, I mean, like historians are terrible prophets, right? But like, do you see a change kind of on the horizon because of that? Or do you think the right-wing media ecosphere is just too large, for anything to really kind of puncture it?
I think that while the Dominion lawsuit is pretty important in terms of accountability and potentially costing Fox and these other shows quite a lot of money, I don't think that they're going to change that much, right? Defamation law in the United States is extremely difficult to make the case for. Like in this case, you literally have these texts from behind the scenes where they're like, should we lie about this? Yeah, we should lie about this. And so that made it extremely easy. But the next time they do this, they can just be like, some voting machines, and they can do the same conspiracy, but they just leave off the person's name and they save themselves $1 billion. So I don't see it necessarily changing the overall practice. In fact, one of the things that we saw from the back and forths that were happening between the folks who were ostensibly on the news side of Fox News and the folks on the entertainment side and the higher ups was that it was also people like Bret Baier who were like, we have to serve our audience. We have to give them what they want. And that kind of audience capture, which has been the case for a while now, nonetheless, is going to continue to draw Fox into a more conspiratorial place because they have to compete with Newsmax. They have to compete with Turn 2.
That rise of those even further rights kind of news shows, right? One America and Newsmax and stuff like that. Kind of crazy. So
definitely. I mean, I think speaking about the media and like that, the case with Dominion, another case sort of comes to mind is, President Trump was just supposedly is going to be indicted on 34 counts of something. We don't know, but one of the most like the first things that came to mind when the news dropped yesterday was we wouldn't be freaking out about this, and this wouldn't be unprecedented that this is the first former president charged with a crime if Ford hadn't, pardoned Nixon, and maybe if, Reagan had gotten in trouble for Iran-Contra. And so my question is just based on your knowledge of conservatives and, the conservative movement and the rule of law, why is it so hard for the conservative movement today to take maybe responsibility for Donald Trump or just move away from him, like move past him, right? Because I know that if, Bill Clinton was like actually like did some shady stuff in Whitewater, besides the actual, sexual harassment allegations, a lot of Democrats would have just like let go and moved on, right? So what is it about sticking to your guns that makes conservatism different?
It's interesting. I don't know that it's always different, but it is certainly as a sort of overall phenomenon quite different. And part of it is that kind of history of impunity that you were talking about. Now, Nixon clearly paid a price for his bad acts. He ended up having to resign. But actually, so my next book is going to be on Iran-Contra and Oliver North. And I'm really, really interested in exactly this question, that there was this sort of surge of new tools for accountability that are put in place after Watergate and even beyond Watergate, right? Coming out of the Church Committee, trying to rein in the excesses of government. Less than a decade later, you have this massive international crime taking place that is coordinated out of the Oval Office. And you even have this extensive investigation. You have indictments of top officials, including the Secretary of Defense. And at the end of the day, nobody really pays any sort of penalty. And somebody like Oliver North is turned into a hero.
Yeah.
Right? He runs for Senate. He has his own conservative talk radio show. He ends up becoming the president of the National Rifle Association. So there is that kind of history of impunity. And I think with Donald Trump, he has done, if you look back over his time as president, he has done a big job of not just saying anything that happens to me is actually an attack on you, so you need to defend me at all costs, but the language about the deep state and the kind of discrediting of the justice system overall, which, you know, the justice system has its flaws, but the way that he has purposefully discredited and attacked any institution capable of holding him accountable, I think it helps to explain some of this. And then the cult of personality that he built around him. It's all sort of snapped into place to safeguard him in moments like this. And just very quickly, I would throw in January 6th as well. This fear that actually we know this person can direct a mob of people against a courthouse or a judge or Congress or whoever. And that serves to also weaken attempts to hold him accountable.
Yeah, I mean, I think the DA has actually gotten death threats from Trump supporters.
Congress is, so they're gonna have hearings about him. So it's not great.
Not great.
So what's the future of presidential power then, right? I mean, is this a model like, I mean, one of the things that has bedeviled kind of the punditocracy, right, is about the use of the F word. Is this a modification? Is this a type of fascism, of this adherence to an authoritarianism within Trumpism, or is it something else? And a lot of it's just kind of this kind of silly semantic kind of thing. But what does it mean for kind of not just kind of presidential, I guess, kind of presidential impunity, but if a president can act in this way, what checks are there? Really?
Yeah.
I mean, we are testing all of that right now, right? Because there have been a number of different ways in which this presidency, even though we don't like to say it, has been unprecedented, particularly towards the end of it. And we've looked for the kinds of, not just norms, obviously we had that conversation for the last 7 or 8 years, but actual laws. How has the justice system, how have these structures and guardrails actually functioned? And we're testing them right now. Can Trump be prosecuted and put in prison? We're about to find out whether or not that can happen. And I think that that's, the future of presidential power. If Donald Trump is not only nominated, but reelected, I think we are going to see not only just how powerful the office of the presidency can be, but just how thoroughly it can overcome any so-called checks and balances. It's a very real possibility that he could be reelected, and the people who continue to scoff at the autocracy and authoritarianism and fascism set of arguments, look around. Look around. If you don't like the word fascism, fine, but to pretend
another word,
just excesses of democracy, or just in some cases politics as usual and liberals getting their panties in a twist, is really missing the boat.
I think another question that really interests me now that we talked about fascism is one thing that sort of comes out of the Reagan years is this sort of macho or like machismo in Republican and conservatism, and this obsession with like maleness and masculinity. Did that play a lot into your research on like conservative media in the 90s and like what it means to be a man versus like not a man? And has that played into your understanding of conservatism, their idea of masculinity?
Oh my God, you're speaking my language, Varsha. So, I mean, both what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, because I do spend a lot of time in this new book on the women anti-feminists of the
Phyllis
right.
Schlafly, yep.
Phyllis Schlafly in the 1970s, but then in the 1990s, a new set of sort of second wave feminist anti-feminists like Ann Coulter and Laura Ingraham and the women of the International Independent Women's Forum. So there's a really interesting conversation to be had there, but also the political archetype of the angry white male and how guns and militias and a particular kind of rhetoric popularized by Buchanan and by Limbaugh really play into those ideas of threatened or endangered masculinity. So I look some at that. This is also something that I'm so eager to dig into with the Oliver North project, because there is this kind of history, especially dominant in the 1980s, of conservative activists going around the country. Like Grover Norquist goes to Angola in order to like fight with the rebels there, or really hang out with the rebels there. And this kind of mercenary freelancing that's happening that I think helps us understand some of what's happening within the Reagan administration, but also that sense of defining yourself as a man in these Cold War proxy wars that are happening particularly in Latin America and in different places in Africa. So I'm particularly interested in diving into that, especially because in the case of North, his particular performance of masculinity is happening right next to Fawn Hall. And the ways that she is defined as a particular type of woman, 1987 is deemed the year of the bimbo, and Fawn Hall is put into that category. So the gender politics of the 1980s and 1990s are endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I just find it interesting that, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, please finish
I was just gonna say that like, one of my friends in the department, he was writing about the Reagan administration, and he like realized that Oliver North also wrote poetry, and I haven't read his poetry, but I'm like very excited to sort of find this because we were just talking about masculinity, and I'm just like, oh, interesting. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I mean, you've derailed me a little bit by thinking about Oliver North writing poetry, but kind of playing off that, we have a question from one of our audience members, one of the viewers, and I think it's kind of related to that, is that bringing us into kind of the 21st century is that one of the things that's been, I think, to longtime observers of American foreign policy, and especially the right, is the sudden embrace of Russia on the right, and especially of Putin and stuff like that. Like, how would you explain that that particular kind of shift about what's going on?
So it actually, sorry, my dog might be making herself known here. It actually predates Trump in some ways. You actually see this fascination with Russia, and particularly the vision of traditional white Christianity in Russia, plays a particular role in the development of the alt-right in that period between 2008 and 2016. And that is not unrelated to the foreign policy preferences of the alt-right, which are pro-Russian, end up being kind of pro-Syria, and then opposed to intervention in Syria during the Obama and Trump administrations. So that's part of it. Another part of it, I think, is the loyalty test. The questions about support for Russia become proxies and polls for, do you support Donald Trump? Because as Russia becomes a player in the 2016 election, and as the evidence mounts that Russia was attempting to sway the election for Donald Trump, then where you stand on Russia's actions and on Russia itself, because of the way that Donald Trump responds to that information, becomes a test of whether you stand for or against Donald Trump. And I don't want to boil it down just to loyalty, but that is a very big part of it. And then you bring in the kind of support for authoritarian governments and for governments that crack down on gay rights, that crackdown on minority populations, and suddenly there is a kind of an ideology that underwrites it. But I don't want to say that every Republican that answers a poll saying, yes, I support Russia, actually shares that broader underlying ideology, because it is a kind of proxy question.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think another question, it's from the audience as well, and it's also like interested me is, I think we've seen a couple of books on it, like Dark Money and others. The question is like, what's the role of money and like the Koch brothers and all these other sort of things and super PACs in the conservative movement, right? And how has it sort of affected American politics? Because this also plays a big role in democratic politics too.
It does. And dark money and just money more broadly plays a big role because it helps to replace the traditional party function of being able to discipline and shape who runs for office and what positions they hold through the money that you give them to run for in a primary or run for re-election. And I do want to say that it's not just billionaires and millionaires who help shape that system, but since sort of 2004, but really since 2008, there's also a way to get small money donations to candidates who you really love, and that small money donation adds up to quite a lot, and it can provide an enormous amount of funds for a particular candidate or to pursue a particular policy. So I don't want to overlook the importance of the super PACs. They've reshaped the entire political landscape in very significant ways since Obama was elected. And Obama himself, who was ostensibly against super PACs, isn't actually against, just like he rejected campaign finance when he was or campaign funding when he was running, public funding when he was running. He also accepts donations from PACs. And so by the time you hit the 2016 election, everybody's playing with that money. I also think that it's important to keep in mind that, again, while that enormous amount of money in politics really matters, and it matters not just for candidates, but for issues like guns, there's also money isn't determinative, right? The candidate who gets the most money isn't automatically the winner. So we also have to be thoughtful about the way that we assess the role of dark money.
Because like Jeb Bush isn't president for a reason,
for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, for a lot of reasons. But yeah, I think so. One question that really bugs me, and it's gonna be my last question, unless Matt has another one, is when you think about Reagan, the first thing most people who are know anything about Reagan think about is the AIDS epidemic, and specifically how the Reagan administration sort of deals with the medical crisis, with the health crisis, compared to how presidents today have dealt with the health crisis, right? Both Trump and Biden combined. And it's not just COVID-19, but also like monkeypox. And so I was just wondering, based on your research, have you sort of thought about anything about how conservatives have changed how they think about public welfare and like health epidemics and the role of the federal government in all of that? And does Reagan have a lot to do with that, right?
Reagan certainly has something to do with that. The slowness to act on HIV/AIDS and the resistance within his government that was shaped particularly by religious beliefs around homosexuality, is also criminal, right? Like the unwillingness to speak about and to treat a public health crisis is obscene, especially when that is conditioned on not respecting the people who are suffering from the illness. And this is actually a very contemporary question as well, because we now have a judge who has ruled that insurers don't have to cover
HIV PrEP. Yep.
Because maybe your religious belief is that people with AIDS should die.
Which is ridiculous, because it's not just queer people who get HIV/AIDS. The reason I ask this is like another thing Reagan does is he's the one who, I think there's a law or something that he overturns that provides funding for contraceptive care to international countries, like foreign aid that include contraceptive care. He overrules that. I forget the name of that law, but he has a big role to play in like pushing back abortion care, which is obviously very important for the conservative movement today.
Not just abortion care, but as you're
conservative, contraceptive, sorry.
No, but I mean, he's obviously against both. So yes,
Yeah.
like that reproductive health care is cut off, that there's a slowness to move on HIV/AIDS. There is this moment that kind of starts to change a little bit in the 1990s. So at the 1992 convention, there's a woman who has contracted HIV who speaks to the audience. And because she is heterosexual and contracted HIV from her husband, she is kind of a more acceptable avatar for the AIDS crisis. Ryan White is also an important player in this as well. And of course, George H.W. Bush does a lot on the Americans with Disabilities front, which helps people with all kinds of conditions and various ailments. Where it is now, though, it's pretty bad. I mean, I'm living in Tennessee right now, and this is a state that is day after day reducing the amount of healthcare that people can access. Obviously, reproductive care is increasingly off the table. Transition care is off the table. There are all of these ways that a party that is ostensibly small government is requiring the government to get involved in the most intimate of medical choices. So that is something that, it's part of a clash within the conservative movement, whether it's Mitt Romney and Romney Care, or whether it's libertarians who have mostly acceded to the wishes of traditionalists in the party who would take this care away. But there is a through line on this issue of public health, because somehow public health ceases to be a government function in the imagination of many conservatives. And that seems pretty wild to me. Yeah,
because go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, is it a retreat from concern about public health, or is it actually an expansion of governmental power in order to deny people access? And I wonder if that, I don't know if that distinction makes sense, but I wonder if it's not just that they're taking away your ability, like in the sense of kind of an ideology of smaller government, that stuff's just not available, but they're actively stopping people from accessing things that other people elsewhere can do. So like, how does that, like, is there any ideological consistency here, or is it simply authoritarianism, right? Like in a sense of kind of, using power to enforce one's will.
Telling people that they can't buy the pill, and telling people that they can't end a pregnancy, and telling people that they can't make choices around transition, and telling people they can't read certain books, and telling teachers they can't teach certain subjects. That is not small government conservatism. Yep. That is obvious. That's quite big government conservatism. And that then brings into question not the big government side of the equation, but the conservative side of the equation. Yeah. And these are features of authoritarian regimes. And that is where the conversation is right now, because those are the kinds of decisions that are being taken away from people, not just in Florida and Tennessee, but in places across the country, particularly as this particular ruling was just handed down. If you lose coverage for basic health care because some frankly bigot out there thinks that you don't deserve it, or that you don't deserve care in general, it's a form of conservatism, but it needs some modifiers. Yeah.
I have one last question. So as we know, I think President Carter is sadly reaching the end of his time. It's very sad.
So, but Varsha.
Oh wait, is he bounced back?
He went into hospice care like weeks ago.
Wow. Okay. Go President Carter. I think basically when I think of the Carter administration, I think of it in very limited scope because I don't spend a lot of time studying it. My favorite thing about the Carter administration is he wants to cut funding for a lot of dams in the West, and everybody in the West, all the Congress people are like, no, you're not doing that. That's all I really know about Carter. I should know more. But he sort of is this exception in this period of long-term conservatism, right? You have Nixon, Ford, then Carter, and then Reagan, H.W. Bush, and then you have Clinton. But I was just wondering, he sort of seems is he sort of does Carter's politics and his sort of compassionate politics and his the type of politics he had, is that something that Reagan sort of pulls on, or does Reagan completely go completely against it, because it's to me, it seems really hard to argue against a peanut farmer who's like deeply religious, who's able to, separate his like religion from the state, and et cetera, et cetera. How does Reagan sort of combat Carter?
So Reagan, obviously in 1980, runs hard against Carter and Carter's legacy, but he doesn't necessarily, I mean, he runs against Carter, the person, in the sense that he basically argues that, this isn't the language he uses, but that Carter's too wimpy to run this great nation, right? And that he feels like America is weak and Americans are weak. And what we need is a strong leader to make America, as Reagan put it.
There's that masculinity again.
Yeah.
That's right. America needs to stand tall again. And that idea of a man on horseback becoming president was very much defined against the image of Carter. On a policy level, however, it's a different story. Carter begins the process of deregulation. He begins the process of monetary policy that makes it possible for the economy to rebound in the 1980s. And he himself, in the 1976 election, was one of the more conservative options. He was part of the evangelical tradition and somebody who represented, even though he was this kind of liberal island in the midst of all of those Republican and increasingly conservative presidents, he was a more conservative Democrat. Now, his post-presidency looks very different, but in office itself, he was a kind of bridge figure and sets the stage, not just for Reagan, but ultimately for Clinton as well. Yeah.
And Clinton is, I think, one of the last sort of presidents that comes from the South, obviously, right? In terms of liberal presidents who come from the South, because I think W is from Texas,
W is
right?
from Texas, right?
Yeah.
But even, after that, you have from Arizona, you have John McCain as the candidate, and he's from Arizona. But that's really, I mean, Trump, I guess, is from Florida, but not really.
Trump is not from Florida. Trump is a New Yorker that New York hates. So my question, you said Arizona, and I have one last question. Sorry, we managed to go a whole hour on conservatism, not talk about Barry Goldwater. What is the like the lasting impact of Goldwater conservatism and the culture wars around that, specifically the welfare state, and that, because you mentioned like John McCain as like the last, conservative from Arizona that ran for president. How do we still have Goldwater conservatism today? Specifically this obsession with like not paying for welfare queens, etc.
And that is clearly still around. It wasn't just that sort of doctrinaire conservatism that he espoused on the campaign trail, but if you actually look at his speeches in 1964, he's early on to the themes of law and order, the idea of the cities being jungles, and this is the kind of language that Reagan is going to pick up. So he is on the hop for the themes about conservatism that are going to define the 1960s. So that is still very much extant in the Republican Party today and in the conservative movement today. What I think is so fascinating about Goldwater is Goldwater by the 1980s and the 1990s wants nothing to do with that conservatism. Because he becomes an avatar for this particular early Cold War conservative movement, and he embraces it. I don't want to pretend like he didn't, oppose the Civil Rights Act in language that was much harsher than just a libertarian position. But by the 1980s and 1990s, he is saying that gay people should serve openly in the military. You don't have to be straight to shoot straight, as he puts it. He calls the new crop of conservatives basically a bunch of nuts. And he basically evolves more purely into a libertarian who does not understand his party by the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Okay.
Lost control of the movement he started.
Yeah,
so,
sure
did. So unfortunately, we are just about out of time. So on that note of unbridled, unchecked conservatism on the rise, and out of control conservatism, I think we'll have to end it there. Thank you everyone very much for joining us, and especially thank you to Nicole Hemmer for a really wonderful conversation. We'll get this episode up on YouTube as soon as I get around to it tomorrow sometime. But please join us again next week. We actually are coming back just next week. Our guest will be Brandon Taylor, a novelist, but also a self-professed history nerd, a prolific video gamer, and he has some thoughts on medieval rulers, which I'm very excited to hear, among other things as well. So, but until then, thank you again, Nicole. Thank you, Varsha. Thank you all for joining us. And let me simply say, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.